intent of what you're doing rather than just having a random magic number with a comment maybe next to it. Next up, you've got functions. So this is pretty cool. This is actually really powerful stuff. So I can take a variable and say, darken this color by 5%. And when that compiles, it'll do the math, the color math, I suppose, on those RGBA values and create a slightly darker version. And again, this gets rid of the magic numbers, and again, really, really reveals intent. So I know what this is doing. This is making the border this color and the main color a little bit darker. If I look at this, unless I've been staring at RGBA values my entire life, this doesn't mean anything to me. This means something to me. This is harder to understand. So that's the real value here. And you can also define your own custom function. So if you want to get really kind of, there's a lot of power kind of hiding behind this feature.
Pete had a question.
Thank you. So is this compiled client-side, or is this something server-side that needs to happen?
Good question. Good question. So SAS is the canonical, the reference implementation is Ruby. So you would normally compile it either at build time or maybe at runtime if you're in development mode. But it would be done on the server. Less, one of the things I actually really like about Less is it's implemented, the reference implementation is JavaScript. So you can just compile this stuff on the fly on the client's browser if you want. I wouldn't recommend that in production for performance reasons, but when you're writing, when you're developing, it's really awesome to just throw this stuff into a browser and just include some JavaScript that will on the fly interpret it. And the same thing applies to the coffee script.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Other questions?
Since we're there, I mean, how much does this add to your development cycle if you're in a typical Java project, for example?
Typical Java project, I couldn't tell you. So
I could tell you it sucks.
Okay, yeah. So I can tell you for a typical Rails project, it sucks. It does. This power comes at a cost.
Yeah.
It does add some complexity to your pipeline. The biggest pain, and I've seen this on many, many projects, is dealing with the trading off wanting at development time to get really fast feedback on the changes that you're making, and then at production time not having to pay any of the cost of this compilation and not having to pay the complexity of extra moving parts. And balancing those two, I think, is still something I still haven't seen a really good solution to this problem. It is a challenge. I think it's worth the cost for the amount of power you get, but there is a cost there.
How often do you use the more powerful functions versus just the variable centralization, which you can do with CSS encoders as well?
How often do you use the more
No-factored
powerful
CSS is an option on the way, right?
So I think almost straight away you want to use the more powerful stuff. Almost straight away you want to use the main thing, which I'm about to get to, is mixins. Almost straight away to remove duplication. The main thing is removing duplication and increasing readability.
So would you say this is something you do on every single code base, or is it something you do on a code base that was a bit more UI heavy? I mean, if you've got the added complexity, does it pay off immediately, or is it something way up the cost?
I think the trade-off is more the type of people that are writing the CSS. If you've got like an old school gnarly web guy, it's going to be really hard to persuade them that they can't use all of the tricks they've built up to work around the crappiness of CSS. If you've got a Ruby dev who's used to crazy ideas like variables, then it's an easier thing.
So, I mean, on that path, are there ways of translating gnarly old CSS to a little bit more optimized SAS or less?
Actually, I don't know.
Not optimized, but SCSS
It's backwards compatible, yeah, I know.
But you don't get an optimized version.
No, but
So
I
there's
mean,
a
what you like
migration
is
past that.
something that kind of like actually like one of the things that I really like about these tools is the nesting of selectors.
Yeah.
That is actually my favorite feature. But I mean, something that actually could take a CSS file and generate something that is a little bit.
I am sure there's like 4 projects on GitHub, and I don't know which one is the right one to use. At least 4. Yeah, it's a good idea. Does anyone know of something that will take a CSS?
The SAS project itself has a CSS to SAS compiler, reverse compiler, whatever.
Huh.
Interesting.
It's like SAS compile or something. It puts it on your machine when you install it.
When did they add that?
SAS reverse.
Is that new?
I just installed it the other day and it was there, so maybe it's new, but it's there now.
Nice.
Awesome. Cool.
How much time do you spend debugging the mistakes it makes when it's trying to
Yes.
Do you know any IDE support for any of those frameworks?
I
Yes.
don't, but I'm not.
Emacs.
Yeah. So that's an operating system support.
I have used less in Visual Studio, and there is a plugin for that. So.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, IntelliJ as well.
Yeah.
And if you want just simple syntax highlighting, there's many syntax highlighters that are already available. Like you're not going to get any sort of automatic completion or anything like that, but you definitely get
Well, I mean,
syntax highlighting.
TextMate and Sublime actually does a good job of knowing what's
For the most
legal
part,
in those
yeah,
cases,
yeah.
and can also compile on the fly and do that kind of stuff.
Sublime on the radar? Okay.
Hold, please.
Okay, moving on. So last feature I'm going to talk about, I'm really annoyed I didn't think to do the nesting, because that's actually like just the quick win answer to Toby's question. Anyway, sorry. I won't highlight what I didn't talk about. So mix-ins is a really big win. So basically you can define a chunk of common functionality, like the rounded cornerness of something, and then you can mix it into to somewhere in your some other kind of style element in your CSS or in your Sass. This is great, particularly for modern CSS, where you have all of these gnarly vendor prefixes. It's also great for modern CSS, where you have very long like animations and transitions and linear gradients and stuff like that. The main power for this is it puts the presentation, it focuses all of the presentation logic here in your CSS, not in your HTML. And I'm going to come back to that when I talk about why we don't like Bootstrap. Foreshadowing. Yeah.
So this is also reminds me of the other feature, which is making it easier for different display formats and different media formats.
Yeah. So you can use it for media queries
Yeah,
and responsive
right.
design and all that stuff. Yeah. So this is really powerful stuff. Really useful. It's amazing how much this can clean up your code. Speaking of which,
Before you get to Bootstrap, what do you think about Compass?
I'm going to talk about Compass in a sec. Actually.
Okay.
Yep. So there's two themes here, I would say. Firstly, this adage that kind of developers have talked about for a long time, don't repeat yourself, the dry principle. You can actually apply this to your style sheets now by using these features. So this is really powerful. This is the stuff that a developer would just assume you get, and a CSS person would assume you don't get. And Sass kind of brings this mantra to the front-end world. And secondly, expressing intent. I think this is even more valuable. So I can open up a Sass file and actually understand what the hell is going on. And I'm not being a CSS guy. A CSS guy can open up 500 pages of CSS and be all like, oh yeah, there's these 5 colors. I can't do that. But I can do that looking at a Sass file. So I think that's the real power. So mix-in libraries. So once you've got all of this power, the obvious thing to do next is to pull out some common functionality and put it into a library. So Compass is one of those. This is what they're kind of the daddy of these, or the granddaddy of these guys. This is kind of developed alongside Sass. There's also more modern things like Bourbon, which comes from Thoughtworks, not Thoughtworks. I haven't used Compass in anger. I know that it's really big.
Yeah, that was my impression as well. I mean, it generates a lot of code and it's pretty big.
Yeah. So,
but it also has a plugin structure, so you can add more things to it. Like that's what kind of makes it extensible.
I think that's good, but I also think the reason we've had projects where part of that pain of getting it into an asset pipeline or something like that was Compass caused a whole extra bit of pain because it was so powerful, and we actually were using one feature of Compass, and we kind of pulled in all of this complexity that was very painful.
It's got the commons, Java commons problem,
Yeah.
where you want to pull in a tiny little string concatenate functionality and you end up getting a 10 meg jar file in.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So it violates that Unix principle of lots of little tools.
Yeah.
And actually, I'll come back to that in a second as well. So I'm going to talk about Bourbon quickly. I've actually never used this, but I went to the webpage, so I know all about it. This I copy and pasted from the webpage. So this is all the stuff that Bourbon gives you. It looks like quite a lot, but actually it's basically just core, the kind of stuff that if you've been using one of these libraries, one of these systems for a while, you're going to write a bunch of stuff over and over again. Oh, I need to mix in a gradient. Oh, I need a variable that will do this thing. So Bourbon just gives you a bunch of this stuff out of the box so you don't have to build it. So you can kind of think of it as like a utils library for Sass. Okay, moving on, grid frameworks. Who here has heard of grid framework or understands this? Okay, that's interesting. So a grid framework is basically a way for non-developers like myself, or non-design people like myself.
It's
It's a good way of post-technical. Yeah. It's a good way for non-design people like myself to kind of look like we're vaguely competent at design. So it's this approach of kind of when you're laying out a design on the screen, kind of making things stick into a grid of columns. This makes our human eyes happy. When you see a page where there's stuff kind of hoggledy-poggledy all over the place, it looks wrong. When you see stuff where stuff's lined up into the grids, you don't notice there's a grid, but it's there and it makes your eye happy. Next time you're looking at any well-designed page, look for the grid and you'll probably see the grid there. So grid frameworks let you do this for web. So you can say something like, give me a div that crosses 2 of these, and then give me another div that crosses 5 of these and is offset by 1. So it's a really, really expressive way, really cheap way of looking vaguely competent at design. If you're a really serious designer, you're probably going to want to push the boundaries of this pretty quickly because you know what you're doing. But if you're someone like me, then this makes you look reasonably competent. These have been around for a while. You don't need to use a CSS processor to use them. But those mix-ins, those variables, those math functions make this really, really, really easy to do in a really, really clean way. Related to grid frameworks is this concept of responsive web design. So this is in the radar under trial. Who here doesn't know what responsive web design is? Okay, so responsive.
Page adapts to your screen size?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Then I do.
So I lost the slides. Okay, well that's lucky that you guys all know what it is because the slides is a bit. So yeah, this idea of
The slide is not responsive?
yeah, it's not responding to my desire for it to be there. So it's the idea of you visit a page on your desktop browser and it looks a certain way, and if you visit the exact same page, exact same HTML on your phone, it's the stuff has been reorganized to be more useful for that context that you're using it in. So this is getting very, very popular. One of the things it leads to is grid frameworks tend to be being replaced by layout frameworks. So if you're laying these things out in these really rigid grids, on a phone you're going to see or really rigid columns, you're going to see 2 columns out of the 12 you're supposed to see. So what you actually want to do is kind of fluidly lay this stuff out in a nice way. So there's this kind of new generation of layout frameworks which are like grid frameworks, but they also allow you to do kind of responsive design without having to do a bunch of the work yourself. So the same way that grid frameworks offload this from you, layout frameworks do the same thing for responsive. So you can take all these guys and kind of pick and choose the right one, put them together, and you've got a good solution. So this is that Unix approach of picking the best of breed tool for the job. The alternative approach is to kind of shove this stuff together and get this big framework, right? So, and this is the same kind of trade-offs we've got here with choosing best of breed tools versus frameworks in other fields of software development. Two of the front-end frameworks that are very, very popular are Bootstrap and Foundation. So Bootstrap used to be called Twitter Bootstrap, it still kind of is, but they actually don't work on Twitter anymore, so I think they're trying to transition that. Foundation is from a company near here in Los Gatos called Zerb. Both of these guys don't have logos, which is really annoying when you're trying to put them on a slide. The only distinction is the font is very, very slightly different. So that's apparently, that'll be on the radar next time around. No logo. Well, logos are in hold, I guess. So these are the two most popular options of these big front-end frameworks. And Bootstrap is one of them. Bootstrap moved from child to assess. So why did we do that? Why don't we like Bootstrap as much as we thought we did? So this is the main reason. Bootstrap encourages you to put presentational logic in your HTML. So for a few years now, we've been learning that the best way to design HTML is to put the semantics of the HTML, the semantics of your layout in HTML, and the presentation details in your CSS. It's a nice separation of concerns. It's something that the industry has been learning for a few years. Bootstrap is, in my opinion, kind of a slide back from that. So this is span 6. This kind of reminds me of TR, TD, width 6%, right? Like all of this the bad old days which we're not supposed to be doing anymore. So by mixing this stuff into the HTML, it becomes very, very hard to change this stuff. You get a glass ceiling of design where once you've got to a certain point, you have to kind of throw Bootstrap out, but Bootstrap is all the way through your HTML. So it's a lot harder to extract out. And if you want to make changes, the same thing. You need to find all the places where you have this span 6 and change it to a span 5. Whatever. So I recommend for a greenfield project, for a client that is just getting into the space, to look at some of the alternatives like Neat or Foundation.
So is that the intention, is that how Bootstrap intended it to be, or is that just it's been abused in that people stick all that stuff in HTML when actually they should be using some of the SCSS or SAS magic or whatever to find that?
Yeah, I mean, it was always in Bootstrap. What's interesting is Bootstrap was always built using SAS. So they could have...
Done it with mixing.
Yes.
Yes.
They could have done that, and that's what Foundation and a lot of these other tools use.
Right.
I don't know the guys, but I would suspect that one of their goals with Bootstrap was to make it ridiculously simple to get this stuff to work. And Bootstrap is ridiculously simple. It's awesome. That's its goal, right? Is to get something going for an internal Twitter team, an internal UI really quickly, and it works really well for that. But again, like I think maybe you don't realize there's a glass ceiling until you got into that glass ceiling. So maybe when they started, they didn't realize they were building this glass ceiling.
In fact, that's the reason why we put it in trial initially.
Yes, right. Yeah.
We thought it was the bee's knees when it first came out.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then we started using it, and then eventually 6 months later, by the time the next version of the radar rolled around, our CSS usage was getting a little bit more sophisticated, and we couldn't break out.
And we were learning the lesson.
Right.
Yeah, we learned the lesson. Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so that kind of wraps up my CSS stuff. If there's more questions, I can take them now, or we can talk about it more at the end of the presentation.
So, do you recommend Foundation as the way forward then, as a replacement for Bootstrap?
So I'll be honest, I'm not enough of an expert to recommend a specific framework. I know I have had experience with Bootstrap, and I know that I have felt that pain. I know that Foundation is very popular, so there's a good user community behind it, and I know that they're learning from, they're kind of a second generation, so they're learning some of the mistakes. But there's other frameworks out there. So Neat is a framework that builds on top of Bourbon, so it's also from Thoughtbot. Thoughtbot seem like they're very smart guys, so I think my shooting from the hip answer is I would look into Neat just because I suspect that they've got things right, because it feels like they're smart guys. But really, you should do a kind of a survey and look at what makes sense for your use case.
And then there is the flip side. I mean, there is a reason why Bootstrap is still in SS and not really in Hold. Like, we don't think it's evil.
Yeah, right.
There is a place for it if it's a completely internal-facing app. You're never going to put it in front of your customers. You don't care about what the branding looks like. You don't care if it looks like a Twitter application inside your own organization used by just 10 people on an admin team. There's a place for Bootstrap there. I mean, you want it to look decent, halfway decent, but you don't really care about customizing it, getting your branding into it, or ever pulling it out. So you're perfectly happy with that, and for that, it's really good to get you going. So there is a place for it, but it turns out it was not as universally applicable as we initially thought it was. Did you have a question?
Well, I was just wondering, this comes back to the eternal, the collaboration between designers and developers, and how these things play into that. Because my experience has been, it actually makes it even harder if you're in slightly more traditional environments.
So I don't work in traditional, maybe I've been working in better environments than that, but so my personal experience, I can probably only talk to that, is on a project where we had a Thoughtworks design guy who was, he was not a developer. He can write some JavaScript. He wouldn't describe himself as a developer, but he was incredibly good at CSS, and he could do stuff with SAS that kind of made my brain melt. Like, I actually had a hard time keeping up with him because he was so advanced. And actually, we paired a lot on building this stuff, and it worked out really well. And I felt like I could actually go into the SAS and make changes, whereas the average CSS, I'm terrified to change something and not change it in all the right places.
But would your recommendation change if you had a more traditional relationship? Like many enterprises have external design bureaus and stuff like that.
Yeah. So the one place where I would say yes, that's a challenge, is this stuff needs infrastructure to get going. So if your design team isn't comfortable using it, or if you need to stand up your entire web stack to use it, and your design team doesn't know how to do that, or something like that, then I'd say that is a point against it. One of the weird cases we ran into was we were building a bunch of our styling using Sass, and we were using a CMS system to bring in the rest of the content. And we got the CMS design team hooked on Sass, and then we realized that we couldn't actually integrate. Like, how do you integrate those mix-ins? It's actually a really, really hard problem, particularly because the CMS system was written in Java, so we had to use this crazy thing called JRuby. I don't know if you've heard of it. only was a contributor to JRuby. We started having to do these crazy gymnastics. So it's almost like we showed them the path, and then they wanted to go down the path, and we're like, oh wait, we're not sure how we can do that.
Speaking to having an external designer, I mean, my team, we do use Sass a lot, and whenever we've needed external designers, they don't actually work on the Sass. I mean, I've just gotten vector designs from them, and I've had to translate those vector designs into CSS, or into
And again,
CSS.
that speaks to how your process is, right? Like
Yeah.
if you're using a more collaborative HTML-driven process, then maybe maybe it changes.
It works very well, like in the case where you mentioned, where you and the person who is doing the CSS are sitting in the same room,
pairing.
working and pairing.
Yeah.
That works really well. But if you're going to a design consultancy, then they're not going to be able. They'll give you CSS, but they won't be able to give you SCSS. So it's much better that you just get the vector files from them and then make it your own.
But there's also the argument too about this whole XD interrelation, right? If that's your situation, maybe you should be poking to change your situation. You know, because you can still do waterfall too, but I hope none of us in this room want to do that, right?
Yeah.
So if somebody rocks up and proposes waterfall, you just say no. Same thing with this. Move along.
Yep. So moving on from there, I'm gonna take on another one of those single solitary lonely blips. So I'm going to be talking about a grand total of 2 blips for the entire course of this talk. So why am I talking about this one lonely blip? This lonely blip, by the way, is JavaScript MV star frameworks. So it includes MVC frameworks, MVVM frameworks. Pick your choice of poison for the thing that goes after the MV.
WS Death Star?
Yeah, I think it's getting close to that with the number. So why am I even talking about this one isolated thing? Well, it turns out that there is only one blip on JavaScript MVC frameworks, but if you see in the techniques quadrant, there's stuff about JavaScript. In the tools and platforms quadrant, there's Zecto as well. I forgot to put that in. There's these two again.
Wait. Did it say capturing JavaScript client-side JavaScript errors, and that's actually in the third outermost?
Yeah.
I think it was an assess. I think it was an assess. Yeah, you're right. It is an assess. It should be probably closer. I would actually do it on all projects.
That would definitely be the laugh test for me, but
I think that's no, but I think that's because
I have one topic like that too.
yeah. So the thing is, we did not have enough projects that were actually doing it and get it. So we're starting to do it.
You're on tape, dude. Don't say
So
that.
so yeah. Got to be honest, you've got to be honest. So, what happened to my animation? Right, and then when you come to the platforms quadrant, the 4th quadrant, there's more stuff. There's require.js and npm and CoffeeScript. So if you see the actual number of JavaScript blips that are there all over the radar, there's a good 10 or 11 of them. So what all of this really comes down to is that we're just building increasingly complex applications in JavaScript. That's why there is this profusion of things that do, everything from server-side JavaScript to JavaScript frameworks and any number of different things in JavaScript. And what this means is if you're building more and more complex applications, you need a logical way to structure them. So specifically for the UI and for the complex UI-based applications that you're building in JavaScript, you need some way to structure them, and that's what these JavaScript MV star frameworks provide you. There are ones coming out every week. I think in the time between when we started this talk and by the time we finish today, there's probably 2. So I can't possibly cover the entire gamut of them. But I'm just going to briefly talk about 2 of these frameworks, which I think kind of represent 2 extremes of the spectrum. Did you have a question? No? Okay, I thought you raised your hand. That's all right. So one of them is Knockout, and the other is AngularJS, which comes from Google. Thankfully, these 2 do have a very recognizable logos. So I'm going to start out by talking about Knockout, and then we'll move on to Angular, and you'll see why. So Knockout is a very simple library. It essentially provides you data binding functionality on your UI. It's what you call MVVM JavaScript framework, Model View view model. So you have a model which represents the persisted state of your data from the server, which you fetch using an XHR request or something of that sort. You have your view, which is your HTML itself, and then you have another class called the view model, which represents the state of the data that's actually shown on the view itself. And the binding between the view, which is your HTML components, and your view model is what is a two-way binding process that Knockout provides for you in a very transparent and easy declarative way. And I'll just give you those examples here. So this is going back to one of the examples that I think Pete had in one of his slides, or will have in one of his slides. Just a simple adder. I don't want to get too complex with this, but if you just have a view model, here I am declaring two add-ins as fields on that view model, and I've declared them both to be Knockout observables. I'll explain what that means in just a second. I've declared a function called a sum, which is a computation obtained by adding the value of the first add-in and the second add-in, but I'm reaching out to them indirectly through that call. And so if I have that view model, I can bind it to my view by making this call in my JavaScript somewhere. Typically you put this in your afterload in your JavaScript jQuery block or something to that effect. And when you call this function, this basically kicks off the two-way data binding process. In your view, you declare your view elements to have these data variables. And by using this data bind property, which specifies what the binding should be and what the nature of the binding should be, there's this little bit of syntax that goes into the value of the data bind value over here. So what this one is saying is the value of the add-in 1 on the model that gets bound into this view is to be represented inside this input field. The value of add-in 2 from the view model is to be represented here, and the value of the sum is to be represented over here. And all of this code results in the world's most boring UI ever, which looks something like that. It has got these three input elements, 3, 4, and 7. Good news is it does arithmetic. Bad news is...
So this is a really good example of not using a grid framework. You see how
yes, it annoys the bloody hell out of you when you don't have one. So yes. No, yes, it's true. That's absolutely true. So yeah, so that's what it provides you out of the box. So what it gives you is, if you just go back to the code example, the good thing is there's absolutely nothing over here that has anything to do with an HTML DOM element. So if you wanted to test this class or any of its behaviors with any of its collaborators, you do not have to do anything with the DOM. You don't need a browser, you don't need any HTML pages, you don't need little snippets of code which represent the rendered HTML, which is going to go out of date very soon, and all of a sudden your test passed but your app fails. So you don't have any of that. So this makes it really easy to test this sort of thing in isolation. And the two-way data binding then takes care of actually making sure that the UI actually represents the state, the visual state that the object data says it has. So you can just write a standard state-based test, and that you can be guaranteed that your UI is going to look like. Yeah?
It's almost that perfect, but not quite.
Right.
So
Yeah.
Knockout still cares a little bit about the DOM, and so you end up having to like hide the DOM from it a bit if you want to do true DOMless testing on it.
Right.
So like it's really cool that it's so lightweight like that. You've just got observables binding things together, but you've still got Knockout embedded inside objects that you would prefer to just be simple.
Your JavaScript objects.
So yeah, it's pretty close to perfect, but not quite.
Sure.
So maybe you'll come into this later, but
Yeah.
if you're doing something like this with observables and so on,
Yeah.
I mean, is there any reason why not go completely reactive using RX extensions, for example?
If you're working in that world, yeah, I would definitely. If you're familiar with that model, I think it would make a lot of sense.
I mean, I don't see the difference between this and reactive extensions, except that they're more general.
Absolutely. I mean, or what was it called? Sprout Core? There was Sprout. Yeah, there was another framework a little bit back, a few years back, which did very similar reactive style programming on JavaScript. So yes, if you can wrap your head around this sort of stuff, and if this sort of stuff is what you've been waiting for all your life, and you understand this really well, there is absolutely no reason to not go with JavaScript RX extensions. And in fact, RX extensions for JavaScript are actually on the radar as a separate blip, because we thought it was really cool.
Could you explain a bit more what that means?
The reactive extensions.
Wait. If we go into an entire...
That is a completely separate area. Reactive extensions is a big enough thing to talk about, and I'm more than happy to have that conversation after
super awesome, but...
After the main body of the talk, more than happy to just sit around here and chat about reactive extensions, because that works in both JavaScript and in your domain code, and it works in a lot of different levels, and I think it's absolutely fascinating. But
So
big topic.
you might get into this a little bit, but Can you talk a little bit about any problems you've had with the on-change style of, looking for differences versus Angular, which has more of a state comparison? Have you actually seen any problems because of the?
I have not used Angular. I have only played around with Knockout. I'm going to be talking about Angular, but that's similar to the way Pete talked about Bourbon. So I've seen it, I've heard other people talk about it, but I have not played with it myself.
Okay.
Because Angular, which I will get to in just a second, and in fact this may answer a portion of your question as to why I've not played with Angular, but I do not have an answer for that specific question. But here's probably why I've not played with Angular. So Angular gives you all of that data binding goodness, and it gives you all of this stuff. There's a lot of stuff. I mean, Angular is a full-on framework, and in the same way that, going back to the libraries, library with a single focus versus a framework that gives you everything in the kitchen sink idea, Angular clearly knows which side of that equation it falls on. It's definitely the kitchen sink. So it gives you a lot. A lot of these things are useful, but you have to take them all in one go. And in fact, the reason I haven't given you a code example is, honestly, if I had to start with a code example, you'd have to understand like 7 different things about the framework in order to start making sense of it in the first place. I mean, and it starts with the concept of a root context, and applications that get bound to it, and then subcontexts that come out from that. There's dependency injection, there is tests, there's templating.
In fact, if I could say so, one of the guys who created this Mish code out of Google, he has his version is Angular is a shim for the browser to make it work the way it should have. You can see the gravity of what he's doing. Like for them, they are really giving you the environment you always wished you had in a browser, and with that comes some serious lock-in and serious pain. Like Bootstrap, you're never getting Angular out of your code if you start. And we have projects that have used it, and you're never getting rid of it.
Which is good or bad, right? Like,
that's right.
Exactly.
It's very
never
productive.
Get Rails out of your code base if you use Rails.
Right. Or you're never going to get servlet container out of your framework.
It's very productive.
Yeah, it's the library versus framework thing. You can choose to put together a bunch of libraries that give you the same thing, or you could choose to go with a framework. The framework will give you initial speed boost and an advantage, but you're probably never getting rid of it because your application is wired to fit the framework. So that's the reason I have not had a chance to play with Angular, because I've not had a full-on application in which I had a chance to explore it, and that's also the reason why I don't have an answer to your question. But hopefully if there are other people here who've actually played around with Angular.
So when do you think Angular would be the right fit then? Given that, so far it sounds quite negative, but I think.
Actually no, it's not. Yeah.
Well, I mean, so we've said that it gets very heavily coupled. It gives you lots of stuff out the box. Like, what would be the use case for which that's the right thing to?
Almost every use case. It's actually one of the best frameworks I've ever seen for what it does for you. There are a few patterns that I think Angular drives you towards. So testing baked in is an example. Like Angular has a model of testing that's very end-to-end driven, DOM coupled. I think there's value in being decoupled from the DOM in a lot of cases, and you can do that with Angular if you do it purposefully. But Angular is not going to drive you in that direction. If you avoid, so I think Angular with some best practices, forgive me for using the term best practices, with some good practices for Angular is probably the most productive thing I've ever seen for front-end development. To be honest, because it captures so many interesting things around asynchrony, promises, etc., and makes them work
and dependency injection and things like that.
Yeah, dependency injection is 40 lines of JavaScript. It's not the end of the world, but it is there.
But they've thought about it.
Yeah, they thought about it. So I actually really like Angular. I've used it a bit, and I've talked to a lot of teams that have used it, and they've all talked about the big boost at the beginning is not indifferent. It's big, the boost at the beginning. And along the way, they stumble on certain things, like there are certain ability to abstract parts of your code and test it independently becomes slightly difficult if you don't follow all of the right practices, which Angular didn't suggest to you along the way. If you do that, I think it might be just an amazing choice.
But, I mean, to be fair, inside of Thoughtworks, there is a lot of contention about it. There are people who hate on it, and there are people who love it.
That's which is
there are even people who do both.
Thing, right?
So it's highly opinionated, so there are people who hate it.
Can you just take a moment and double click on what you just said? Sure. For the projects that people go through, like they love it, but sometimes they run into this problem where they didn't do this thing.
Right.
What's that?
So there's a couple of things that I've seen. One, so Angular offers some features that people don't learn about because the dependency injection is kind of in your face, but the services abstraction model is a great way of doing sort of data sources or kind of getting away from getting your XHR out of your core. Right. Some people don't pay attention to that. And even when they do, that is actually one of the least rich parts right now in terms of patterns. So if you look at the Angular forums, you'll see that a lot of people, the basics are there, but how do you deal with real sort of different parts of a page accessing the same service, caching things between them? Angular's not actually helping you. So it kind of leads you in one direction and then leaves you with a couple of things because it's still growing as a framework. So that was one place people ran into pain, is they sort of bought into a certain concept like services and then they didn't get much out of it. And they had to kind of go into the framework to try to figure out what to do next. And that's the danger of frameworks, right? Is that instead of you wiring things up, you get that extra boost of not wiring anything. When you need to get in there, now you've got to go trolling in the source code, right? So that was tough. The other thing, which I don't think is relevant anymore, but I'll tell you it happened, is we had teams that got on before the 1.0 release, and that's, to be fair, they weren't 1.0, and so they were making pretty radical changes and ripping stuff out and leaving it for dead, and so that caused some teams trouble. The last thing I noticed teams had trouble with was, from a testing point of view, when you're trying to do sort of DOM-less testing, right, you're really abstracting all of your presentation logic away from your DOM code. But Angular's not driving you in that direction. It's actually driving you to conflate everything. Yeah. Once you've done that and you want to do some more isolated testing, the only option was to sort of effectively borrow the Angular compiler. So for those who don't know, Angular's way of working is it boots up your app, grabs all your HTML, recompiles in a lot of extensions to it, and it does that very, very fast, so you almost don't see it. And that for them is a feature. The downside is the magic that happens in there, if you had to try to intercept something, painful. They have a few odd, badly documented features for being able to like compile your own templates, but kind of like the pipeline concept. Once you start trying to go into that, now you've got some serious setup cost. So I think if you use Angular for what it does best, which is basically being a shim, right? Knowing all the different events that can be happening and letting it help you with some of that, that's good. But use MVVM style patterns as well that kind of keep your presentation logic well separated from your DOM logic, which Angular's not going to ask you to do. It's actually going to explicitly tell you not to do that. Their controller concept is kind of like actually everything in the world is in their controller by default. If you stay away from that, I think you can get the best of both worlds.
The analogy with Rails is actually kind of prominent in what you said.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
So I'm gonna have the last word because I want to keep moving it.
Sorry, I totally derailed that.
No. But I guess the theme to all of this is that as you're building more and more complex applications, you not only want a framework that can help you, but you also want the ability to have a well-factored code base that can be tested, and that leads you into JavaScript testing.
Oh, look at that! Yes,
It's a great plan for you.
So I want to talk about Angular for a second. So my last I get to have the last week because I'm holding this thing. So a couple of years ago, Paul Hammond, a thought worker, long-time thought worker, honorary thought worker, was talking about how Angular was Rails for the client side, and we need to get on board. And I totally dismissed that. I was like, dude, whatever. It's this thing that Google are using internally that like has less stars on GitHub than something else. Yes, that was actually exactly what I was thinking. And he was, but in retrospect, he was so right in so many ways. All of the benefits and all of the downsides of Rails are exactly the same with Angular. In about 2 years' time, we'll have the renaissance of Angular where people will be talking about how we need to redo the original things with Angular in a different way, just like we did with Rails. I really think it's amazing that he said all the stuff. I was like, yeah, it's seriously impressive.
Will we have Angulars?
Of course, the lesson is, and I guess you'll come with that with testing is, but the lesson is exactly. I mean, if you can see that parallel now, you can spare yourself some pain 2 years from now.
Yeah.
That's why I say use Angular wisely. I think you might get the best of both worlds.
Yeah. So I think this would be advice for frameworks in general. Don't fight it too much, but try to keep to core principles of not embracing the framework too much and keeping stuff separate. Just like people are discovering now with Rails, don't put everything in the controller. Don't put everything in the model either. Actually use object-oriented design. I think the same thing will happen with Okay, segue over. Now we'll talk about Angular testing JavaScript. So my next theme is talking about testing JavaScript. There's a few things in the radar that kind of touch on this. And I'm going to kind of run through these and kind of talk about them and how they relate to the testing of JavaScript. So the first thing I've got up here is Node.js. So for those of you that didn't ride here on your single-speed bicycle, drinking an espresso on the way with one hand leg rolled up, Node is the hipster framework of choice. It's probably post-hipster at this point. There's a framework that I don't know about that like some hipsters like do. Node is so mainstream now. Does someone know what the framework is? I need to say.
Which framework is it? Well, it's not Express anymore.
Yeah, right. So Node is this really interesting server-side JavaScript tool that lets you build network servers. So most people use it for HTTP, but you can also use it for other kind of network servers. It's a very low-level library. It's event-driven, non-blocking, asynchronous, which means it has really great performance characteristics for certain use cases. Generally, when you're kind of I/O bound, you're not actually doing that much work in the CPU. You're passing stuff off to a database or a backend service. You can get a bunch of concurrent clients on the same server very efficiently. And the reason I'm talking about it in terms of testing is, so Node is yet another example of why we should be really taking JavaScript more seriously as a real programming language. So we've been saying this for years, even without server-side. We're doing more and more programming on the client side where our JavaScript code bases are growing and growing and growing. But with things like Node, we're at the point where our entire application stack could be in JavaScript. Maybe we've got some CouchDB stuff in the database, which is also in JavaScript. So Node points to what we've been saying for a while. JavaScript is a real grown-up language. I personally like it. I think I'm maybe in a little bit of a minority there. But it's a real grown-up language. We're using it to build real applications. We need to start taking it seriously. We need to start writing tests for this language called JavaScript. I kind of feel like that's a funny thing for me to be saying, but that's actually kind of controversial in the JavaScript community, I think. The average JavaScript project doesn't have that much automated testing. This is a shame. It's something I personally really want to help fix. But so yeah, Node is one of the reasons why we should be thinking about testing. But Node isn't just a server-side thing. You can also use it for command line applications. So something that's right in adopt, I'm not sure I agree with it being in adopt, but right in adopt is using Jasmine plus Node for testing your client-side code.
I mean, I just don't understand why it's plus Node. I mean, why is it not plus Phantom.js or plus Rhino or plus...
So
That's a great question.
I'll get into that.
I agree with you completely. Adding all that infrastructure.
Yeah. I'll get into that a little bit, and I also question why it's Jasmine plus Node.
That's yeah.
So
I agree.
So Jasmine is...
So X plus Y.
Yes, something else is really good.
In order to do testing.
So Jasmine is probably the most popular test running tool for client-side JavaScript. For server-side JavaScript, probably something like Mocha is more popular, but it's kind of probably the most popular testing framework. So that's why Jasmine is here, I would say. It has its flaws. It's not perfect. It was kind of the first big tool in its space, and it has that kind of baggage that it's carrying along with it. But it does the job. It's not terrible. But you can.
It's not an XUnit framework,
Yes,
which kind of places it way above the low bar.
Sure. Yeah. It's not the worst thing in the world. So what we've done, and what we've had quite a lot of success with, and I can personally talk to having success with this, and other projects and client projects within Thoughtworks have had success with this, is writing our client-side, testing our client-side code outside of the context of the browser. So a lot of the stuff that Badru was just talking about is that loads of that stuff with Knockout you can test without actually needing to bind to the DOM. Toby annoyingly pointed out that's not quite true. We'll pretend Toby's not here. But so if you try and run most of your unit tests in Node, you are forced to write a lot of your code outside of the context of the browser, not bound to the DOM, and you're forced to segregate your UI code and your application. And part of my point here is we're building applications here, we're not building presentation layers. You're forced to separate these two out by virtue of the fact that you don't have a DOM when you're running in Node. You can use something like JS DOM, but if you're using something, I would advocate for not using something like JS DOM if you're tempted to use a DOM. We'll talk about Phantom.js in a second. So this is a really interesting a tool for forcing you to keep your presentation layer, your stuff that messes with the DOM, skinny and logic free, and putting most of your logic and therefore your tests in a kind of a DOM agnostic place tends to lead to a better design, I would argue. Yes?
So you said that Jasmine wasn't your favorite thing here. Like, I know it's on your list, but what would you put in instead of Jasmine?
So up until a couple of days ago, I would have said Buster. So Buster is a test running framework from the guy that wrote Sinon. Really smart guy. He wrote an awesome book on testing called TDD JavaScript or TDD JS.
Christian Johansson.
Yes, that guy. And so I was really fired up on Buster. I actually went and looked at the project a couple of days ago, and it seems like it hasn't caught traction, so I'm reserving judgment on that. Something like Mocha is probably a better choice. I'll be honest, although I think Jasmine has its flaws, the fact that it's so popular means that I would probably default to it.
Yeah.
It's not that bad. Its main flaw is the way it deals with asynchronous code. So that's it. So the thing that I love the most about Jasmine plus Node is the speed at which this stuff runs. So I was on a project that was a fairly full-featured pure JavaScript mobile application. Our unit test suite for the entire application ran in 2 seconds, possibly 1 second, I can't remember. That's amazing. Like, I don't know if you've ever worked on a project where you literally save the file and you automatically run the test suite for your entire application before you even have a chance to move your eye up to look to see if it passed or failed. It has a really impressive effect on the feedback loop. And testing is all about fast feedback, and 2 seconds is pretty awesome feedback. So, like, I almost wish I never worked on that project because I miss that project every time I sit there and watch unit tests. So this is a great side effect. So yeah, this focus on segregating the DOM is the main benefit that I would argue. But for some people, that segregation of the DOM comes at a cost, and you actually would argue that maybe you want to test how you interact with the DOM. If you want to do that, then there's a tool called Phantom, which is in trial. So Phantom is a headless WebKit browser. It's essentially I think it's a Qt WebKit or something like that, compiled for the command line, and it doesn't need a windowing system of any kind to run. That means you can run it on your CI server without having to mess around with XSFB.
Oh, so you don't even need it to install?
No.
Because that's the
Phantom you don't.
installed. Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's a very simple tool to use. It's surprisingly simple to use. You're at your allotment of interruptions, by the way. So it's really easy to set up. It's really easy to get going in the CI environment, but it's a full WebKit browser, which means you've got all of the DOM available to you. So you can test all of your DOM interaction code and be fairly confident that it's going to work the same way as it would work in at least a WebKit browser. i.e., all bets are off. That's not a comment on Phantom, that's just a comment in general. i.e., no. Okay, so I think this is really good, but I still prefer Node. There's people who in Thoughtworks would argue that you can just use Phantom for all of your unit tests. It takes a little bit faster. It doesn't enforce DOM segregation, but you've got one less moving part. So if you have all of your tests in Phantom, then you just have to run Phantom to run your tests. You don't have to have Phantom for some kind of tests, Node for some kind of tests. So there's definitely a trade-off there. I fall on the really liking Node because of the segregation and the speed. I've had many debates with coworkers that prefer Phantom, using Phantom for everything because it's less moving parts. So there's definitely a trade-off there. Last thing is CoffeeScript. So CoffeeScript is it's kind of like the same way as Sass to CSS, CoffeeScript to JavaScript. It's a language which compiles or transpiles to JavaScript. You could think of it as JavaScript, the good parts, codified into a language with a nice syntax. Definitely nicer than JavaScript.
The syntax is nicest to me.
We should have that debate. I really like CoffeeScript. I'm a fanboy of JavaScript in general. So why am I talking about it in the context of testing? It fits really well with test code. So a property of most JavaScript test code is it uses loads of anonymous nested anonymous functions. And CoffeeScript is really nice at making those look less ugly and revealing the intent. So it's a real testing code is a real sweet spot for the CoffeeScript DSL. Let me show you why. So here's a really straightforward Jasmine test that tests that JavaScript can add two numbers together. So how does CoffeeScript make this code better? So first of all, it removes the semicolons. And then the next thing it does is removes these extraneous parentheses. And the best thing it does is removes this ugly thing that I hate typing. So what you're left with is something that just talks about what your code is doing. You don't have all of this noise of parentheses and punctuation and function, paren, blah, 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 blah. You just have the core of what your code is doing. So again, this expresses intent. This is a load of noise that you learn to read. This is easier to write, easier to read, easier to maintain. So I love CoffeeScript for testing. The other thing that is really interesting is when you start using CoffeeScript for testing your JavaScript code, it can act as a gateway drug towards using CoffeeScript for more than just your test code. So we saw this same effect with Ruby a few years ago, where people started off using Ruby to do their acceptance testing, and then maybe they'll write some compiles or some build time scripts, and maybe they'll start playing out with Rails for an admin UI, and before they know it, they're a Rails shop, right? Hopefully, maybe. I think CoffeeScript can have the same effect. It's a really nice, safe place for you to try CoffeeScript in your testing code. I think you'll see immediate benefits, and you might end up starting to use it in your production code. So that's why I pull out CoffeeScript. That's the end of my testing JavaScript spiel. Questions?
I had a question. So, about runtime compatibility. So you're testing stuff that's going to run in a variety of different browsers, which maybe are different inside Node.
Yeah.
And so that sounds like there's the potential for problems.
Yeah. So I think doing that stuff inside of, I'd almost argue for that being a reason for doing stuff inside of Node. So the stuff that you're testing inside of Node is just the core JavaScript domain logic. There's no browser stuff in there. So the only kind of incompatibilities you have is incompatibilities between the JavaScript runtimes themselves, which tend to be fairly compatible, apart from the fact that in IE, if you have a trailing comma, it will not work. And we found this out. Many people find this out. So if you're testing most of that stuff with Node, then the stuff that isn't really presentation layer, so isn't really browser specific, you can not think about that stuff, which means that when you are testing browser specific, when you are testing presentation stuff, it'll be in a different context, your brain is in a different place, and you're actually thinking about this stuff. So we took it to the extreme. On the project where we used Node, we didn't do any unit testing at all of that presentation logic. We used other levels of testing. We used integration testing, kind of Selenium-driven tests or WebDriver-driven tests to verify that the DOM worked the way we were expecting it to work. So that let us, we could run those tests in different browsers. Now I would say if you're using Phantom, you are at a risk of falling into the trap of, oh, it works in WebKit, but it doesn't work in Firefox, probably doesn't work in IE. So I think it's a really, really valid concern if you're using Phantom. It's maybe less of a concern if you're using Node.
It's fine.
No.
No, I was just, I agree with you, 95% of all the compatibility problems are in the DOM.
Yeah.
However, the rest of the 5 that I've found, the 5%, is actually in the standard libraries and how they're not completely compatible with each other, sometimes missing functions. And this is a concern with different versions, of course, as well. I haven't found a way of solving that, but I think it's something to be aware of.
So do you mean like standard libraries that are in the browser, like
yeah,
storage?
yeah. I mean like when the standard functions on array and string and exactly how they work, stuff like that is not completely compatible.
Okay, so there you go. There's an argument for.
And there's also implementation differences in stuff like set timeout and things like that.
Sure. Yeah, and I would advocate for things like set timeout. You shouldn't be testing that inside of Node, or you should be using some different mechanism for doing that. Maybe. But that's an interesting point.
Some people argue actually to create a separate test suite just for those kind of weird oddities that your code uses, and kind of run that separately in lightweight rather than conflating that problem with the rest of it.
Yeah. Although that
if you do Gmail, that probably makes sense.
Well, it introduces a lot of arbitrary layering in your application code to do that. I would suspect.
Yeah, it's
So I'm not really trying to direct your attention anywhere. I'm just going to use a laser pointer. So the really awesome part of the presentation is coming up, but I figured since we offered you alcohol, we should offer a quick 3-5 minute break just to give everybody a chance to get up. There's a men's bathroom sort of if you wind your way around the corner over here. There is more beer.
There's also a ladies' bathroom.
Yeah.
which is just down the corridor from here.
Yeah.
So when are we reconvening?
5 minutes. We'll start.
So 45.